Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. Today we have a very fascinating topic, as most of you probably will agree, ancient Egypt. There has been so many movies, obviously, made about ancient Egypt. Thousands and thousands of books written about ancient Egypt. Well, Dr. Price will discuss a little bit about the different events occurring in ancient Egypt and what characterizes it, what makes Egypt so unique, because it's extremely unique. Now, when we think of Egypt, most of us, the first thing we think about, pyramids. That's what we think about, maybe a pharaoh, pyramids. But interestingly, the pharaohs were not, and the nobility actually, were not always buried in pyramids. Before the Old Kingdom period, which Dr. Price will discuss, the Old Kingdom, but even before that, the Egyptians actually buried their dead in the sand. That's how it started. They simply buried their dead in the sand. They would bury certain household items with their dead, so that practice stayed the same, obviously. More elaborate, of course, for the pharaohs. So the Egyptians realized that this hot climate would actually preserve the bodies, kind of mummify them, if you will. Again, that's another thing that we think about when we think about ancient Egypt is mummies, mummification. Then the ancient Egyptians decided that they would build what's called mastabas. These were rectangular buildings, very small. It wasn't elaborate. They were not huge like the pyramids, but just a rectangular building, and they would bury their dead here, especially in the times before the Old Kingdom, which Dr. Price will catch up with. Also, with the Egyptians, thinking about mummification, the Egyptians actually had a process in order to create these mummies. They wanted to preserve the bodies as much as possible in order to, so the pharaohs would have their body to come back to. Usually this process of mummification took 70 days. That's an extremely long time. There were certain aspects to mummification that were pretty interesting, I guess you could say. One, of course, is the fact that they would basically usually go in through the nose with a very sharp instrument, because the Egyptians didn't feel that the brain was very important at all, which I find very interesting. So they would basically remove the brain. It's always a fun thing. There were certain organs that the Egyptians would save. Okay, they would save the liver for one. They would save the stomach. Those were a few of the organs that they saved. They would put them in these canopic jars. They're called canopic jars, and they would save them. And a lot of archaeologists that have discovered some of these burials have seen these canopic jars. We actually have them. Now, they would stuff the body. They didn't, obviously, if you take everything out of your body, then it's not exactly lifelike. Not that a mummy is lifelike, of course. So they would stuff it so that it appeared lifelike. They would paint the body. They would also paint it, cosmetics. Jewelry was placed on the mummy. The body was rubbed with things like spice and natron. Natron is, of course, salt, which dries up the body. They couldn't have these mummies, of course. Moisture is not conducive to keeping these bodies intact, obviously. So they had to dry them out. Now we have a problem because eventually, of course, as you'll find out with Dr. Price, the Egyptians start to build pyramids. Of course, the most famous are the pyramids of Giza. And this was not exactly a great secret. It's kind of hard to hide these huge pyramids, especially when you have these tomb robbers or grave robbers out there. I mean, these pyramids are like beacons. Come rob me, because they know that there's going to be riches beyond imagination inside of these pharaohs' pyramids. And so even though the Egyptian workers tried to create false doors and things of that nature, these huge pyramids the pyramids of Giza were robbed. So we don't have all of the riches that were, of course, placed in these pyramids at Giza. Now, eventually, since we're discussing burials, I might as well say that eventually in the New Kingdom period in Egyptian history, that the Egyptians realized it's not a great idea to advertise where these pharaohs are buried. So they started to hide the pharaoh tombs. It's called the Valley of the Kings. And it's, of course, in this Valley of the Kings that in the 1920s, an archaeologist discovered the tomb of a very famous boy king. His name, of course, was Tutankhamun, or King Tut, as most people are familiar with King Tut. His tomb was discovered, and amazingly, as I'm sure you all know the story, amazingly, it was found intact, which was usually not the case. Even in the Valley of the Kings, we had issues with grave robbers. The archaeologist that had discovered King Tut's tomb in the 1920s was Howard Carter. Of course, this lends itself to the famous Curse of King Tut, which has made really interesting movies, and it's been great for a lot of people to write books on. A lot of deaths were associated with the opening of King Tut's tomb, although, it made for good TV. Obviously, not every single person that worked on the opening of King Tut's tomb died a mysterious death. A lot of people died, but not everyone did. So if there was a curse, obviously it didn't hit every single person that entered King Tut's tomb. But it makes for interesting stories. So these workers, a lot of times the question is asked, why were they forced to do these things for their pharaohs? Were they forced to build these huge pyramids? It's not like they had, machinery to place these huge stones and make them so precise. That's what's so interesting about the pyramids. They're so precise, and the angles and the positioning is so precise. They were not forced to. It seems like, the pharaoh, and as we'll find from Dr. Price, he'll discuss more about what the pharaoh's role is in ancient Egypt, but it was a labor of love. It seemed to be a labor of love for these Egyptians. When they were not harvesting their crops, they would be working on these pyramids at Giza. And then, of course, much later, carving out these tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Okay. Also, too, I didn't mention the other two. I just remembered I did not mention them. So I wanted to mention the other two organs, because you never know when you might need that information, that were taken out of the mummies. We had the lungs, liver, intestines, and stomach. Those were the 4 that were preserved, I guess you could say, or saved in those canopic jars: lungs, liver, intestines, and stomach. I don't know. I find that interesting as well. All right, so we know that geographically, Egypt has a very important waterway running through it. Dr. Price will discuss this more in depth, of course, in his upcoming lecture, but it is the Nile River. The Nile River did everything. It flooded regularly. Everyone knew about when it would flood, so they could be prepared. It was a highway. It connected Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, when you think of Upper Egypt, it's not, when you look at a map, it's not at the top. Actually, Upper Egypt is on the bottom. Lower Egypt is right there by the Mediterranean Sea. Lower by the Nile Delta. Upper is, of course, below it. It's a little backwards there. So I wanted to make sure you knew that. Okay. The Egyptians, for the most part, throughout their history, the Egyptians were pretty peaceful, at least in the beginning. Dr. Price will discuss a group of foreigners that will come into Egypt and take over for a while, named the Hyksos. The Egyptians learned from these people, and they learned that they were maybe going to have to be a bit more aggressive coming into the New Kingdom period, which they were. The Egyptians were much more aggressive in the New Kingdom than they were in the Old and the Middle Kingdoms of Egyptian history. The New Kingdom not only saw the Valley of the Kings, of course, but as Dr. Price will mention, famous pharaohs, King Tut, of course, being one of them. He probably would not have even been known. We would never have known his name, more than likely. He was very young when he died. He was a boy king. There was really nothing of note to his reign as pharaoh. Of course, he is famous because his tomb was found intact. And this was, of course, he was a New Kingdom pharaoh. There were a few other New Kingdom pharaohs that are very important and famous. We have Akhenaten. Dr. Price will talk a little bit about Akhenaten. He is famous because Egyptian religion was polytheistic. Poly meaning more than one god. Akhenaten changes that, at least for a brief time. It doesn't stick, but Akhenaten changes the Egyptian religion to a monotheistic, to worship of one god. Of course, this god is called Aten, which is the last 4 letters of Akhenaten's name. Aten is his god, and Aten is not, with Egyptian gods previous to this, and after this, by the way, because once Akhenaten dies, this religion dies with him. Egyptian gods were portrayed as kind of like half animal, half human. The jackal, the jackal is known for scavenging the dead. Well, the Egyptians had the jackal. You see statues of him, an actual jackal, protecting the sarcophagi, the sarcophagus of the mummies. So in religion, the jackal is a protector of the dead, but in real life, you need to keep, when the bodies are going through the process of mummification, you definitely need to guard them, okay, because these jackals will scavenge anything. But this changes with Akhenaten and his god Aten. Aten is actually portrayed as the sun, giving off rays of light. So it's not an animal or a human. It's just a disc, like a sun with rays of light coming down. Of course, Akhenaten was the blessed, I guess you could say. You needed to respect Akhenaten if you were going to do well in this new monotheistic religion. But, he died, like I said, and his religion dies with him. And the priests and the Egyptians were just more comfortable going back to their polytheistic religion. Dr. Price mentions a little bit about the polytheistic religion in his upcoming lecture. There was another very interesting pharaoh that comes out of this New Kingdom period. His name is Ramses. I believe Dr. Price talks a little bit about Ramses. Ramses was interesting because it seems that he was he had a lot of kids, put it that way. Ramses fathered over 100 sons and over 50 daughters, not all with the same person, thank you very much. He had numerous wives. And throughout all this, he managed to live to about 90 years old. How do we know this? Because we have his mummy. We have his mummy. We can tell that he was extremely tall, and not a lot of people were around 6 feet at this time period, and even after. People's heights tended to grow over the centuries. The average Egyptian was a little over 5 feet, and so this was extremely tall for a pharaoh. He reigned over 60 years, so he was pharaoh for quite a long time. So he's actually a very interesting pharaoh as well, that Dr. Price will discuss a little bit more about that as well. And I also wanted to mention one other figure here in the New Kingdom period. Now, this happens to be a woman, all right? Not a man, but a woman. Her name is Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut will actually become pharaoh. She will rule as a pharaoh. And this in itself is very interesting, that a woman will actually rule Egypt as a pharaoh. She wore the typical headdress of the Egyptians, the pharaohs that is. So she took that office. Now, she wasn't given that role as pharaoh initially, but she definitely took it, obviously, from her, I want to say it was her nephew. It was a relative, and she was kind of helping him out because he was very young at the time, and she ended up simply taking over. Hatshepsut, some have compared her to famous future queens, though, such as Cleopatra, also Egypt, Catherine the Great, who was very powerful ruler in Russia much later in history, and Elizabeth I, who was extremely powerful. And she, of course, was the Queen of England. But Hatshepsut ruled in her own right, and she ruled as a pharaoh. So that is very interesting. When she died, she had actually built, a lot of these pharaohs will build temples and things of that nature. When she died, her successor had her name scratched off of everything. He wanted to wipe her off the face of the earth. He did not want any sort of memorial to Hatshepsut, and we don't know where she actually is. We don't know where her tomb is, or even if she was buried in a tomb. We're not very sure about that as well. But we do know about Hatshepsut, so he didn't erase every single thing about her. So let's listen to Dr. Price as he discusses a little bit more about ancient Egypt.
Ancient Egypt was located in the valley of the Nile River, which flows northward from East Africa into the Mediterranean Sea. Most of the valley is very narrow and surrounded on both sides by dry mountainous desert. At the mouth of the river, where the Nile enters the Mediterranean, the land spreads out into a wide, fan-like delta. The Nile has been the lifeline of its region for much of human history. Nomadic human hunter-gatherers began living in the Nile Valley through the end of the Middle Pleistocene, some 120,000 years ago. By the late Paleolithic period, around 40,000 years ago, the arid climate of northern Africa became increasingly hot and dry, forcing the populations of the area to concentrate in ever greater numbers along the banks of the Nile. Now, the Nile performs the same purpose for Egypt that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers do for Mesopotamia. It provides water and rich soil to a land that would otherwise be a desert. Like the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile floods annually, but its flooding is regular and easy to predict and easy to control. The flood takes place in mid-August after the harvest has come in. Its gentle flooding leaves a deposit of rich soil just in time for planting season. The Egyptian calendar was based on the various phases of the Nile River. Indeed, the Nile was such a gentle provider of necessities that settlers on its banks were slow to take up agriculture. Wildlife flourished along the river, so the earliest Egyptians could hunt and fish and exploit wild plants for food in order to meet their needs. Now, by about 5000 BC, Egyptians had domesticated sheep, cattle, and goats, and they had begun to raise wheat and barley to supplement the Nile's generous natural bounty. Village communities that were fully dependent on agriculture may not actually have appeared in Egypt until around 3500 BC. Since the Nile was fairly easy to control, no large workforce was necessary in order to exploit it, so settlement patterns along the banks of the Nile tended toward village communities rather than the great cities that dominated Mesopotamian civilization. City formation was further slowed by the fact that communities did not need walled cities or armies because the Nile Valley is virtually surrounded in the east and west by nearly impassable desert. This desert not only provided protection from outsiders, but also provided metal ores and good building stone that provided the building materials for Egyptian civilization. By around 3300 BC, two kingdoms existed in the Nile, the Upper and Lower Kingdoms, and they were united around 3100 BC when the king of Upper Egypt conquered the entire Nile Valley. Now, we know this because a stone pallet from the period honors a certain King Narmer, or Scorpion, as the first ruler of both the Upper and Lower Kingdoms. Now, this is also the first time we begin to see the writing system that the Egyptians used, which is called hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics appear on the Narmer pallet, although they may be somewhat older. One side of the pallet shows Narmer wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, and on the other side he wears the crown of Lower Egypt. It was easier to both create and preserve a central government in Egypt because everybody lived on the river. Additionally, trade and government were simplified by the fact that the Nile provided one great highway for the entire kingdom. Prevailing winds made it possible to coast north on the river current and then to sail south in the other direction. In short, the Nile provided Highway 1 and only for Egyptian civilization. The heart and soul of Egyptian civilization was its monarchy. It was so important that the office of the king became the dominant institution of Egyptian history. The Egyptian king, called the Pharaoh, had enormous power, enormous prestige. Egyptians believed that their king was also their chief god, which I'm sure you'll agree goes beyond the Mesopotamian view that the king only represented the gods. Pharaoh was divine in a number of ways. At first, he is identified with Horus, one of Egypt's sun gods. He was also linked with another sun god, Ra. Pharaohs were, of course, mortal. They, like everybody else, were born and died. So how could Egyptians consider them to be gods? Well, there are lots of things in nature that are born and die and are reborn every year. Every day the sun does just that. It's born in the east and it dies in the west. And Pharaoh was, after all, a sun god. But it was still the same sun, yes. The year was born with the Nile flood and died at the end of the year when the Nile River ebbed. Nature is full of rising and dying cycles, and the gods are part of nature. And so the Pharaoh's reign and his divinity follow the same pattern. One after another, for nearly 3,000 years, pharaohs were born and died, each a new iteration of the sun god. Each living pharaoh ruled over the world of men on the banks of the Nile, while the dead pharaoh represented Egyptian affairs among his fellow deities. Needless to say, Pharaoh's control of Egypt was essentially absolute. He commanded the army, he ran the government, he supervised trade and religious activities, he dispensed justice, he coordinated food production, he provided patronage for Egypt's artisans and craftsmen, he owned everything and every person in Egypt. Of course, he had certain, shall we say, less mundane duties. As a god, he caused the sun to rise each day. He caused the Nile to flood at the appropriate time. He encouraged the fields to bring forth their bounty, and the animals and people of his kingdom to be fruitful and multiply. This enormous power enabled the pharaohs to mobilize Egypt for massive public works programs like irrigation and levees, military activities on a large scale, and the building projects of enormous proportions. The only limit to Pharaoh's power was theoretical. Egyptians expected him to rule justly and to preserve the balance among the various competing forces in nature and in society. He was expected to preserve and exercise something called ma'at in all of his dealings, both human and divine. Now, ma'at is a kind of complicated word. At its simplest, ma'at means justice, but a better definition might be balance, as in promoting the balance between man and nature, worldly and divine, order and chaos. Egyptians believed that the appropriate behavior of the pharaoh preserved all of these balances and provided justice and order to his people and his realm. For this reason, Egypt never adopted any codes of laws. The only law was the will of the pharaoh, whose word was, by definition, law. In fact, Pharaoh's authority was limitless because all authority within the Egyptian state rested with him. Now let's talk a little bit about the chronology of Egyptian history. Archaeologists have created a chronology of Egyptian history based on the dynasties of the pharaohs and on watershed events that have had an effect on the narrative of Egyptian history. The chronology that we will look at today is as follows. The earliest period we'll look at is called the Old Kingdom of Egypt, and it goes from about the 27th to the 22nd centuries BC. Now the next period is called the First Intermediate Period. It goes through the 22nd and 21st centuries, a little over 100 years. The third period is called the Middle Kingdom. It goes from the 21st to the 17th centuries BC. And then there's a second intermediate period from about 1640 to about 1570 BC. The final period we'll talk about today is called the New Kingdom of Egypt. It goes from about 1570 to 1070 BC. Now, after the creation of one Egyptian state, the first important stage in Egyptian history is called the Old Kingdom. It extended from 2700 BC down to around 2200 BC. During this period, the pharaohs had their greatest power. This is the era of the pyramids. Egyptians believed during this time that only the god king was immortal, and so when the pharaoh passed on to live with the gods, Egyptians built huge tombs for their rulers, and essentially the height of this tomb building is expressed in the creation of the pyramids. Now, we used to think that the pyramids were built using huge numbers of slaves to provide the labor. Most archaeologists have abandoned that notion. They no longer agree with that. Plentiful evidence exists that these amazing tombs were built entirely by free Egyptian labor who left their fields during periods when agricultural labor wasn't really needed and worked for their pharaoh on these great tombs. There are 138 pyramids that have been discovered so far in Egypt as of 2008. Most were built as tombs for the country's pharaohs and their consorts, their queens, during the Old and very early Middle Kingdom periods. The earliest known Egyptian pyramids are found at Saqqara, which is northwest of Memphis. The earliest among those are called the Pyramid of Djoser, which were constructed around 2630 BC. This pyramid and its surrounding complex were designed by the architect Imhotep and are generally considered to be the world's oldest monumental structures created of dressed masonry, that is, made out of stone. The earliest attempts to create pyramids were architectural failures, which either collapsed on themselves or were not perfect pyramidal structures. The perfection of the architectural process may be seen in the Great Pyramid of Giza, which is near modern-day Cairo, which was built for the pharaoh Khufu. The Greeks called him Cheops. This is the largest of the pyramids. It consists of an estimated 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing between 25 and 80 tons. It's approximately 756 feet on a side. That's the length of about 2.5 football fields, and 455 feet high, which makes the Great Pyramid at Giza 5 feet higher than the Louisiana State Capitol building in Baton Rouge. The mass of the Great Pyramid is about 6 million tons. According to tradition, it took 20 years to build. In the Old Kingdom, pharaohs ruled Egypt with the help of an enormous bureaucracy. We have identified some 2,000 titles for various officials of the pharaoh in the Old Kingdom. Now, since Pharaoh controlled every aspect of life and civilization, he needed a horde of royal officials to get stuff done. Egypt was highly centralized, but only minimally urbanized. In other words, even though it had a strong central government, it had virtually no cities, no cosmopolitan areas to speak of. Most Egyptians lived in small farming villages along the banks of the Nile, so administration was subdivided into small units of local government. Groups of small communities were combined into provinces, and these provinces were called nomes. That's without a G, by the way, N-O-M-E-S. There were 21 in all, and a royal official called a nomarch administered each nome. These administrators were the pharaoh's eyes and ears and hands in each province. To pay the nomarchs, pharaohs gave them land to farm. Now, initially the nomarchs ruled at the king's pleasure, and if the king lost interest in them, they might be fired or retired, they might die, but gradually the lands and the title became the property of the nomarch. Gradually the title became hereditary. And from the Old Kingdom then, an Egyptian aristocracy began to grow up. Nomarchs began to use the profits from their lands to create private armies that were loyal to them. Eventually, the nomarchs became strong enough to fight with each other for dominance, and even finally to revolt against the pharaoh. This happened in about 2200 BC, the beginning of the First Intermediate Period. It brought down centralized government for nearly 200 years. Egypt was reunified around 2000 BC when one family of nomarchs defeated all the others and established themselves as pharaohs. And this created the next period in our chronology called the Middle Kingdom. And it lasts from about 2000 BC down to about 1800 BC. The new dynasty, the new pharaoh, established a small standing army to defend the pharaoh from his rivals. These pharaohs during the Middle Kingdom were pretty good generals. They used their military to maintain order at home and begin to expand their empire. They kept the nomarchs under control, and over time these administrators became more important but more strongly controlled by Pharaoh. During this period, they began to share power somewhat with their royal masters, and this new order is illustrated by the fact that Middle Kingdom nomarchs began to build elaborate tombs for themselves. Archaeologists believe that during this period, Egyptians came to think, to believe, that all men could earn immortality by living just lives, living by ma'at. Now, as a result of this new belief, Egyptian thinkers began to try to define more exactly what a just life was, and to draw up lists of specific rules to live by. Over time, some writers began to explore the possibility that it might not be necessary to actually live a just life so long as the soul could convince the divine judge of the afterlife, that you had lived a good life. So you begin to get books and tomb paintings that show the departed, what they will have to go through to arrive at the place of judgment, and what the soul should say to the gods in order to achieve immortality. Strong and stable government during the Middle Kingdom gave Egypt 4 centuries of peace and prosperity and stability until it was finally brought down by an unanticipated outside attack. In 1630, Egypt was invaded by a people whom the Egyptians call the Hyksos. Now, these were Semitic people whose ferocity and military technology made it possible for them to conquer the better organized and more numerous Egyptians. In about 1660, the Hyksos crossed the Sinai Peninsula and occupied Lower Egypt. Of course, Lower Egypt is the part of Egypt that borders the Mediterranean. They brought down the Pharaoh and forced the nomarchs of Upper Egypt to pay them tribute. The Egyptians, protected in the past from outside invasion, were unprepared for the Hyksos, who brought with them the latest in military technology. The most important of these tools, these military tools, were chariots. Now, it's unclear whether the Egyptians even had made much use of the wheel before 1700 BC. Simple sledges or sleds were all that they needed to drag goods to and from the Nile. They had oxen and donkeys for beasts of burden, but we think that before the Hyksos arrived, they may not have used horses very extensively. Now, by 1700 BC, in Asia Minor, warriors were employing the chariot with great effect. Egyptian military technology had, by the 1600s, not really changed since the late Stone Age. Most of the weapons in the Egyptian arsenal were made of stone. And although they possessed the bow, it was mostly used for hunting. Enter the Hyksos armed with bronze weapons and chariots and powerful bows. Hyksos archers speeding across the battlefield in chariots very quickly devastated Egyptian infantry. When it came to military affairs, the Egyptians, fortunately, were fairly quick learners, and in a few generations, the chiefs of Upper Egypt mastered the new technology, built chariots of their own, which were actually vastly superior for desert fighting to those of the Hyksos. And in 1550 BC, the Egyptians expelled the Hyksos from Egypt, and a new pharaoh and a new line of pharaohs recreated the Egyptian kingdom, and this is the beginning of the new kingdom. Now, these new pharaohs of the new kingdom had learned that isolationism was a luxury that they could no longer afford. New kingdom pharaohs embarked on a series of conquests that expanded the kingdom and brought Egypt to the height of its wealth, the height of its power, and the fullest extent of its territories. Thutmose, who ruled from 1504 to 1492 BC, the third ruler of the 18th dynasty, led armies as far east as the Euphrates River and south into the mineral-rich Sudan. Now, over the next 200 years, The Egyptians expanded their empire well beyond their river valley. By 1425, Egyptian warrior pharaohs had expanded into Syria, Palestine, on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, into the Near East, south into Nubia, and west into Libya. Wealth flowed into Egypt from these new tribute states and sparked the most ambitious building program since the pyramids. The most important Egyptian acquisition in terms of wealth came from that territory south of Egypt called Nubia. Now, Nubia had a vast quantity of gold. Nubia was required to pay a huge annual tribute in gold to the pharaoh. And pharaohs would spend lavishly on palaces and temple complexes and on the source of their new power, the army and its commanders. One result of the pharaoh's attention to temple complexes was the growth of the power of the Egyptian priesthood. Now, increasingly, during the latter part of the Middle Kingdom and the beginning of the New Kingdom, the temple priests of Egypt had become wealthier and more powerful, especially in local affairs, and had come to be the administrators of the pharaoh. By 1350 BC, the priests of Amun-Ra owned nearly a quarter of the land in Egypt. In fact, their power had begun to threaten the power of the pharaoh himself. They also threatened the prestige and power of the relatively new military aristocracy that clung to the pharaoh for their influence. Now, perhaps as a result of this new danger, a pharaoh named Amenhotep IV, who ruled from about 1352 to 1338, announced that henceforth Egypt would worship only one God. A relatively new deity named Aten, A-T-E-N, which was a personification of the disk of the sun. In 1348, the new pharaoh changed his name to Akhenaten, beloved of the sun. And he moved the capital from Thebes, which had been heavily invested with priesthood, to a new location out in the middle of the desert, which he called Akhetaten, the horizon of the sun. Now, today, the archaeological site for this city is in a place that has the Arabic name of Tel El Amarna. So you might read about new finds at a place called Amarna, and this was Akhenaten's capital. The new religion was a royal religion. Its rites were conducted by the pharaoh himself and his family. In other words, the new religion didn't require a priesthood. It was supported by the military aristocracy and the pharaoh's court, but it really wasn't very well received by other Egyptians. The very conservative Egyptians had no desire to change their religion. Well, in around 1336, Akhenaten died, and his son, Tutankhaten, came to the throne. Shortly thereafter, the young pharaoh changed his name to Tutankhamun, and the court returned to Thebes. Amarna was abandoned to the desert, as was Egypt's brief experimentation with monotheism. Tutankhamun's successors would all be military men who expanded Egypt's power in the ancient world and the prestige of the pharaoh after Akhenaten's dangerous experiment. The most important of these great warrior builders was a pharaoh named Ramesses II. Ramses was an amazing pharaoh, an amazing builder. He constructed about 1/2 of all the monuments that you would see if you were to visit Egypt and float up and down the Nile looking at the antiquities. He fought a large number of campaigns and was largely successful in maintaining the greatness of the Egyptian empire in the face of new and dangerous Eastern and Western kingdoms. He also tried his best to ensure the dynastic future of his family. He had some 160 children, I should say with the aid of a pretty impressive harem. His 60-year reign was about the longest of any pharaoh. In many ways, Ramses' reign marks the high point of Egyptian history. And as we will see, the end of the Bronze Age and beginning of a new threat, not only to Egypt, but to all of the ancient world.
Well, that was extremely interesting, Dr. Price's lecture on ancient Egypt. And, what I found very fascinating is the geography of Egypt and how Egypt was allowed to be so peaceful. I know Dr. Price mentioned that these communities did not need to have walls around them or armies here in the beginning, because the Nile Valley was virtually surrounded by natural barriers. I found that very interesting. You have the Mediterranean Sea in the north. You have the Red Sea, of course, over in the east. You have mountains in the south, and you have what's called the Sahara Desert, which is not very hospitable. In fact, we will discover there can be whole armies lost in the Sahara Desert. There was a Persian by the name of Cambyses, and he's known for his lost army. They went into the desert and they disappeared, swallowed up by the desert. So this keeps a lot of people out of Egypt and allows Egypt, as we have heard from Dr. Price, to develop a unique culture, a unique religion that's not built off of, say, the Sumerians, a unique social structure with the pharaohs. I also found it interesting when Dr. Price mentioned that the Egyptians did not need laws. They didn't have anything written down, like the Code of Hammurabi that we've discussed with the Babylonians in previous lectures. So I find that the pharaoh's word is law. Extremely, extremely fascinating. Now, I also discovered during Dr. Price's lecture that, during this early time in Egyptian history, that we find this pyramid known as Saqqara. It's found at Saqqara, and it's extremely, extremely old. It's around 2600 BC, roughly 2600 BC. And it's much smaller in nature, of course, than the pyramids of Giza, but it was the beginning of the big, huge pyramids of Giza that sprung up during the Old Kingdom. Pyramids like for the pharaoh Khufu. Dr. Price mentioned that the length of about 2.5 football fields was the pyramid built for Khufu over in the pyramids of Giza. That's just amazing. Over 400 feet in height. 5 feet higher, Dr. Price mentioned, than the Louisiana State Capitol building in Baton Rouge. And I'm sure we've all seen that. And imagine 5 feet higher than that. Simply boggles the mind. Well, I hope you enjoyed Dr. Price's lecture on ancient Egypt. For our next lecture, Dr. Price will continue discussing a little bit about ancient Egypt. He will actually compare it to Mesopotamia. We've heard a little bit about Mesopotamia in previous lectures, so we know a little bit of information about Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, or the Amorites. And so now we're going to compare these two societies. Should be very interesting. Until next time.